So the great thing about democracy is that it lets us choose our leaders. But what happens when we come to regret the choice that we made? What if the guy we elected turns out to be so horrible we think we have to get him out of power as soon as possible? Is it possible in a democratic system to remove a leader after they've been elected, but before we have a chance to vote them out in the next election? In theory, almost every democratic country says yes, of course. But in practice, most of the systems that we have dreamed up to get rid of a leader outside of an election are very flawed and controversial, and it is very rare for them to be used successfully. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to look at the question of how to remove a leader based on the post-war experiences of 8 democratic countries: the United Kingdom, the United States, France, Germany, Japan, Israel, Brazil, and South Africa. I picked these 8 countries because they are all relatively stable democracies, they're all located in different parts of the world, and their political systems have all evolved relatively independently of one another. So before we can begin the process of trying to remove a leader, we first have to answer the question, why? What exactly has the leader done that is worth kicking them out early for? Well, one obvious answer would be that they've committed some sort of crime. This seems like it would be a relatively uncontroversial reason to kick someone out of power, but alas, it is not. This is because in many countries you are not even allowed to file legal charges against a leader while they're in office, which certainly makes it a lot harder to prove criminal wrongdoing on their part. In France, Japan, Germany, and Brazil, their constitutions straight up say that the leader is immune from all criminal and civil charges while in office. In the US, the situation is a little bit more constitutionally ambiguous, but it is the current policy of the US Justice Department to not file criminal charges against a president while he's still in office. This is sometimes called the doctrine of inviolability. Now, why, you ask, do countries have rules like this? What is the point of protecting a leader from the consequence of breaking the law? Isn't everyone supposed to be equal in a democracy? Well, sure, in theory, but in practice, a leader also has a way more important job than anyone else. A job he was given by the people. So the argument goes that it would be basically undemocratic to distract him, possibly for years, with burdensome legal proceedings for a charge he might not even be guilty of. As Fordham University law professor Jed Sugarman put it,
all you need is one prosecutor, one trial judge, the barest amount of probable cause, and a supportive local constituency, and you can shut down a presidency with a criminal trial or 2 dozen.
Similarly, imagine a leader was, in fact, successfully charged, tried, and convicted. What then? Well, presumably they would go to prison. In America or Japan, they could in theory even be executed. This gives unelected prosecutors and judges enormous power to basically overthrow a leader who has been democratically elected. Then there is the more complicated legal argument that posits that since a prosecutor ultimately derives their power from the executive branch, and since the leader is head of the executive branch, a prosecutor cannot prosecute a leader without creating some sort of legal paradox of insubordination. Note that what we are talking about here is very different from the question of liability. Basically, all political systems recognize the idea that you cannot sue a politician personally for things that they do in their official capacity. So you can't take the president to court for manslaughter if your kid dies in a war or something. But immunity from liability means it can also be quite difficult to judge a leader's behavior strictly by the standard of criminal law. Or as President Nixon famously put it,
well, when the president does it, that means that it is not illegal.
Now, of course, I should note that in some countries, their leaders do not enjoy any of these sort of protections at all. Israel is probably the most extreme. Their constitution says that not only can their prime minister be charged with a crime while in office, if he is found guilty of a crime, which the court states involves moral turpitude, he is automatically removed from office. This is actually a relevant issue in Israeli politics right now because their current prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, has in fact been charged with a crime. If he is ultimately found guilty, he could become the first Israeli prime minister to be removed from office in this way. In other countries, a leader can be charged and convicted while in office, but nothing automatically happens to them. Great Britain and South Africa allow their leaders to be charged with crimes while in office, but even if they're found guilty, nothing automatically happens. So in theory, the British Prime Minister could be sent to prison and he wouldn't lose any of his powers. There was actually some light speculation about this possibly happening in the UK a while ago, back when Boris Johnson was talking about possibly not obeying some of the anti-Brexit laws that were being passed by the Parliament. Alright, so if committing a crime is not necessarily enough to get rid of a leader, what about doing something that, while not technically illegal, is still really bad? Now we are getting somewhere. The constitutions of France, Brazil, South Africa, and the USA all say that the leader can be removed from office for committing certain offenses which are defined by the Constitution rather than the criminal law. These are sometimes known as impeachable offenses. In France, their constitution says that a president can be removed if he has committed a breach of his duties patently incompatible with his continuing in office. In South Africa, it says that the leader can be removed if he has engaged in serious misconduct. In the US, the president can be removed if he has committed treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. The Brazilian constitution has a very long list of no-nos. Their president can be removed if she has committed acts against the existence of the Union. Free exercise of the powers of the legislature, judiciary, public ministry, and constitutional powers of the units of the Federation, exercise of political, individual, and social rights, internal security of the country, probity in administration, the budget law, and compliance with the laws and court decisions. Now, the problem with putting language like this in the Constitution is that these terms are all fairly ambiguous. For example, whenever they try to impeach an American president, which is of course going on right now, everything gets bogged down in a debate over what exactly a high crime and misdemeanor is. That's a very old-fashioned British legal term that wasn't even clearly defined in its own time. And to this day, no one really agrees what it includes or what it doesn't. Which brings us to the next part. Who decides? So in all of our countries, the ultimate authority over whether the leader should stay or go is left up to the legislature. Sometimes only one chamber, sometimes both chambers together. Sometimes it's just a simple majority vote. Sometimes it's a super majority vote. In America, a president can only be removed if a majority of the House of Representatives votes in favor, followed by a 2/3 majority in the Senate. In Brazil, there has to be a 2/3 vote in both chambers of their Congress. In South Africa, it only has to be a 2/3 vote in the lower house of their parliament. In France, both houses have to vote by a 2/3 majority just to begin the process. And then there has to be a 2/3 majority of both houses combined to actually remove the president. In the UK, Israel, Germany, and Japan, it only takes a simple majority vote in the lower house of their parliament to remove the leader. But their process is also a bit unique and complicated, so we will talk more about it in a bit. But yes, in every country, the decision is ultimately made by the legislature, which is just a big group of politicians. At no point are any courts or judges involved. Even when the embattled leader is permitted to have a trial in the name of due process, as is the case in the US and Brazil, the whole thing is still ultimately run by politicians. What all this means, a lot of people would argue, is that despite the Constitution's lofty language about holding a bad leader accountable for committing crimes against the national dignity or whatever, the process is really best understood as a purely political one, which is to say the charges and punishments are best understood as decisions made by politicians for political purposes. There is a famous line about this from Gerald Ford, who was a US congressman who later became president, and he was once asked to define what exactly an impeachable offense is, and he said,
"An impeachable offense is whatever a majority of the House of Representatives considers it to be at a given moment in history."
That sounds very cynical because it implies that even though the Constitution says that the leader can only be removed for committing very serious offenses, in reality, he can be removed on basically any random pretext so long as the legislature is prepared to vote against him. But of course, the other side of that is that the leader could have committed an offense that any reasonable person would think that the constitutional process exists to punish him for, and yet he could still very easily get away with it if the legislature was full of people who loved him. During the late 1990s, a hostile US Congress attempted to remove President Bill Clinton on the grounds that he had lied to a grand jury and obstructed justice in the course of attempting to cover up an affair he was having with a young intern. The motion passed with a majority of votes in the House of Representatives, but failed to get the necessary 2/3 majority in the Senate. The vote was almost entirely party line, with Clinton's party voting against and the other party voting in favor. The main thing that saved Clinton was just that the other party didn't have a 2/3 majority in the Senate. We don't know yet on what precise grounds they are going to attempt to remove President Trump, but it will almost certainly fail by an even wider margin. President Trump's party currently holds a majority in the US Senate, which is something that President Clinton's party didn't even have. In South Africa, similarly, President Jacob Zuma successfully beat back a removal attempt in 2016. His party had a comfortable majority in the parliament, so I don't exactly know why the other party even attempted this. In Brazil, however, they successfully removed one of their presidents just a few years ago. In 2016, President Dilma Rousseff was removed from office for improperly using billions of dollars in loans from government banks to fill budget shortfalls and pay for social programs. As all presidents facing impeachment inevitably do, President Rousseff and her supporters argued that these charges were not sufficient grounds for her removal. But as Brazilian historian José Murilo de Carvalho put it,
"If you don't have control of Congress, you can be impeached, even if the arguments are not so strong."
And President Rousseff's party did not have control of Congress, so that was the end of her. Now things get even more dubious when we consider the leader removal process in Germany, the UK, Israel, and Japan, the so-called vote of no confidence system. In all of these countries, the constitution says that the parliament can vote by simple majority to remove the leader at basically any time. These countries all use the parliamentary system, which is theoretically based around the premise that a prime minister derives his power from his ability to keep the majority faction of the parliament satisfied. As a result, in Israel and Germany, the parliament can vote at any time to remove the prime minister and install a new one. In Israel, the new guy then has a maximum 42 days to win a second vote of approval from the parliament. And if he can't pull that off, there has to be an emergency parliamentary election. In the UK, similarly, if the parliament votes a prime minister out, they are given 14 days to either approve a new prime minister or there will be a parliamentary election. In Japan, when the parliament votes a prime minister out, he is given a measly 10 days to either schedule an election or resign. The logic of having emergency elections as part of this process is supposed to ensure that the government will always have some degree of democratic legitimacy. So if the prime minister derives his power from being able to control the parliament, but the parliament decides that it doesn't like him anymore, but also isn't prepared to appoint someone new in his place, then we should ask the voters to elect a new parliament in order to do a kind of hard reset on the whole situation. Now, once again, none of these countries offer up any particularly strict standards regarding on what grounds the parliament can vote out the leader. The way it's phrased in the constitutions is that the parliament has a right to vote that it has no confidence in the leader's administration. But of course, confidence is a very vague and nebulous concept. Does having no confidence mean they don't have faith in the leader's basic competence? Or do they lack confidence in the leader's moral character? Or is it just that maybe they don't like his political agenda? In the absence of clear guidelines, the no confidence voting process in these countries has become every bit as political and partisan as the impeachment procedures in the previous countries we looked at. Maybe even more so because the fact that a no confidence vote can trigger an emergency parliamentary election provides an added incentive to an ambitious opposition party to instigate one whenever they have the numbers. Since 1945, by my count, there have been 4 occasions in which one of our parliamentary democracies have voted no confidence in one of their leaders. Now, probably the best example of this process working has been in Japan, by which I mean 2 Japanese prime ministers have been non-confidence voted by something other than a pure party line vote. In 1980 and 1993, 2 different Japanese prime ministers were both non-confidence voted, And in both cases, it only happened after a significant portion of their own party turned against them. Both of these rebellions, in turn, were inspired by substantial allegations of serious corruption within the ruling administration. And in both cases, these prime ministers responded to their votes of no confidence by calling an election and attempting to run for another term. In the first case, Prime Minister Masayoshi Ohira actually died in the ensuing election campaign, so there was no closure there. In the second case, Prime Minister Kishi Miyazawa lost the election quite decisively. In 1979, the British Parliament voted no confidence in the administration of Prime Minister James Callaghan. This was a rather dark time for Britain, as anyone who has been watching The Crown lately will know, and Callaghan was considered broadly incompetent. As the New York Times reported at the time,
unlike some confidence motions, which are tied to specific issues, this one was general, simply expressing an overall lack of support for the government.
But that being said, Callaghan's party also didn't control the majority of the seats in the parliament. And as a result, the vote against him, which he lost by only one vote, was entirely along party lines. And since no other British politician was able to successfully cajole the parliament into approving them as prime minister in his place, Callaghan was able to simply call an emergency parliamentary election in which he ran for a second term, which he then lost to Margaret Thatcher. West Germany, 1982. The chancellor was a guy named Helmut Schmidt, who was head of a two-party coalition in a three-party parliament. But then one of Schmidt's parties betrayed him and formed an alliance with the other party and voted to make the leader of that party chancellor instead. To once again quote the New York Times,
"The Free Democrats broke with Mr. Schmidt in a dispute over the government's economic policy that centered on the Free Democrats' demands for drastic cutbacks in welfare spending, which Mr. Schmidt refused to accept."
So this was another non-confidence vote that was basically grounded in a broad policy disagreement with the government. But unlike Prime Minister Callaghan, Chancellor Schmidt surrendered with grace and never attempted to run for chancellor again. Now, what have we learned from all of this? Well, I would say that the idea that the legislature should be able to vote out a bad leader makes sense in theory, but in practice, it is almost impossible for a group of politicians to get together and make a decision about something like this in a fair and impartial manner. This is because the driving force of politics isn't really the individual judgments of the politicians themselves, but rather the highly disciplined and often highly ideological political parties they belong to, also known as partisanship. Any political party's ultimate goal is to seize power from whatever party is currently in charge. Accordingly, that seems to be the sole frame through which most politicians will make a decision as to whether or not to use their powers to remove a leader. Put simply, so long as a leader's political party controls the legislature, it will never vote to get rid of him because it would be completely against their partisan interest to do so. This is presumably the reason why leaders who get removed often proceed to just run for re-election again. They assume the whole removal process was just a big partisan stunt and prefer to let the people decide. When they tried to remove President Clinton in 1999, the Congress tried to get around this by also imposing a ban on Clinton ever serving as president again. Although I guess by that point in his term, it wasn't that much of a danger. But such a punishment is allowed by the US Constitution and is in fact made a mandatory punishment by the Constitution of South Africa. But if you don't impose this punishment, it sort of weakens the seriousness of the whole process. So is everything just hopeless then? Does partisanship mean that we are forever stuck with crummy leaders with no way to get rid of them before the next election rolls around? No. One of the big reasons why removal procedures against leaders are not that often used is because we have discovered that a much more effective way to remove a bad leader is to just ignore the Constitution and instead use the power of shame. When a leader is obviously corrupt or horrible or unfit for office in some spectacular way, the media will obviously make a big fuss about it. His poll numbers will plummet, and other politicians within his own party will come to see him as a giant liability who is going to hurt their own chances for re-election in the future. As a result, in most of the countries we have looked at today, over the last few decades, there have been numerous instances in which bad leaders have been simply shamed into resigning their office. In fact, by my count, the only country that has not seen one of their leaders resign in shame over the course of the last half century or so has been France, which can only mean that France must have the least corrupt, best liked politicians in the world. Nice job, France. So what do you think is the best democratic way to get rid of a bad leader? Which country's procedure do you think is best? Let me know in the comments. Do not forget to give this video a like, and I will see you all next week.